Did you just get your first camera today and your photos are looking a little bit like this? Well, my name is Nakul. I'm from Sipping Visions Photography, and today I'm going to be taking you to a basic tutorial to kind of walk you through how to take your photos looking from garbage into something mind-blowing that could once end up on somebody's wall. So stay tuned and let's go through the little basics that could take your photos from 1 all the way up to 100. So are your photos coming out a little bit too grainy or very, very dark? Well, one simple trick can help you master those photos for perfection, and that's called ISO. What ISO is essentially exposure, adding artificial light to your photo. So if you're in a very bright environment, such as a sunny midday or towards like the early mornings when the sun's already up, you ideally want to be in a lower ISO situation. You don't want to have your camera add artificial light in to make it more difficult to go and get those sharp, clean pictures. Whereas if you're in darker environments, say the studio, for example, you want a little bit more ISO if you don't have any external lighting. What that'll do is help your camera be able to focus and get your photos to the best of their ability, but if you crank it a little too high, you're gonna get those noisy, grainy photos, and if you have it too low, you're gonna have the issue of having too dark of a photo. Best rule of thumb is to start off with changing your other settings first and have your ISO for last. If you've already adjusted for your shutter speed as well as your aperture, then start playing around with your ISO and see where you can get. But ideally, as a rule of thumb, don't try to move it too high, try to keep it as low as you possibly can, and if you can, edit it up in post later down the line. In Lightroom and Photoshop, they also have a nice denoise tool that can help you go ahead and remove some of that grain if you do end up taking your photos in very dark environments where you have to crank it up pretty high. A good rule of thumb there is if you're anything beyond 3200 ISO, ideally you should check it out, make sure your photo is sharp, and if it's not, try to see if you can use some external tools like Photoshop or Lightroom to go and help you.
I clap. Are you struggling to get sharp photos? That might be because of your shutter speed. Shutter speed allows you to freeze the motion, and that could be in action shots like sports, or wildlife with moving animals, or even cars running by, or just a person running. It's just a way to freeze the motion and make sure you get that crisp image in that time frame that you want. So how shutter speed works on cameras is that there's always a number, it's a fraction. So for example, a high shutter can be 1/1000. And what that means is that your shutter is taking the picture at 1/1000th of a second, so very quickly. And then a low shutter is something like 1/30, or you could do it for 1 second for a long exposure. So the purposes of a low shutter is to capture motion. So that's, for example, if you have running water through a river, or if you want to do night gazing and you want to get the stars, or if you just want to catch someone moving and make it look a little cool, or those light shots on highways that have running lines, just like this. And what people don't realize is that shutter speed is also another form of controlling the light in your photos. If you don't want to bump your ISO to make noise, you could also lower your shutter a little bit to then make your photos look a little bit brighter. And then you could also up your shutter if it's a little too bright outside and it's sunny and you want to keep your ISO low. When starting, shutter is definitely one of the main key aspects to make your photo either better or worse in the different scenarios that you choose from. The best rule of thumb for me is to make sure you go out and you explore and you try these settings out. When you realize what shutter speed you need in different scenarios, it's gonna make for the best for your photos.
You ever see those photos and they just have that clean, milky background where everything is perfectly blurry and everything looks so sharp like in the subject? Well, that is completely done by aperture. And what aperture is essentially the opening of your lens, which determines how wide or closed your lens actually is. For example, this lens I have here is at 1.8, which means that I can open my aperture pretty wide. Think of it as your eye. The wider your eye is, the more light that actually comes in. So this lens, if I were to go down to 1.8 aperture, it opens pretty wide. Whereas if I wanted to go and reduce some of the light that's coming into my lens, I would push it to about f16, f18 to get that very narrow and tight eye that I can get more light in. And some of the main purposes of aperture, obviously, are about how much light is coming in. So that helps you control your image, making sure that it's not too dark or not too bright. But another aspect of aperture is also focus. If you have very small apertures like 1.2, 1.8, chances are if you're taking a photo of a subject, say a person for a portrait, there's a chance they might be out of focus. Whereas if you're taking photos of something really small, they might be in focus at a higher f-stop, say f9, f8. So where that comes into play now is also how your photos look. If you were to go down, like I said, to that f1.8, you can get that clean, smooth background, whereas if you want something that's more in focus, you would want to go higher up in f-stop, like f9, f10. Here's a few examples that you can see on screen that can show a couple different examples of how aperture can play into effect for your photos. You'll see things from more dark and blurry backgrounds, as well as things which are a lot more in focus, as you can see by the examples on the screen. Now that you guys have all the information that you need, go out, start taking photos. Please tag us on Instagram at Sipping Visions and let us know what you guys are taking. Make sure you keep an eye on that ISO, shutter speed, as well as aperture, and go ahead and take those nice photos.